There is a moment in every great partnership when one person becomes the story, and the other becomes the footnote. Sergio Perez spent 3 years building a dynasty. He just didn't know he was building it for someone else. When Sergio Perez signed with Red Bull Racing in January 2021, the move looked like a lifeline. Honda was pulling out of the sport. Racing Point, the team that had given him a home, was becoming Aston Martin. And after 11 years of grinding through midfield machinery, Perez was one contract away from the front of the grid. But here's the detail the headlines missed. Many in the paddock believed Red Bull wasn't looking for a driver who could challenge Max Verstappen. They were looking for one who wouldn't need to. In Formula One, the second seat at a top team isn't a partnership. It's a job description. And that job description, the one written in ink nobody reads aloud, goes something like this: score enough points, stay close enough to matter, but never threaten the man in the other garage. Perez had spent a decade mastering the art of doing more with less. He was precise, he was consistent, and by most accounts, he was not the kind of political force that disrupts team hierarchies. For Red Bull, analysts argued, that wasn't a flaw. That was the entire pitch. And in those early months, the arrangement looked like it might actually work for both sides. Perez won in Baku. He scored critical points across championship weekends. He was, by any honest measurement, one of the most effective second drivers the sport had seen in years. But the problem with being the perfect number 2 is that the moment you start winning, people start asking questions. 2022 changed everything. Red Bull's new car, the RB18, was not just fast, it was generational. And inside that car, Max Verstappen didn't just win the championship, he rewrote what winning was supposed to look like. 15 victories, the fastest laps, the records that had stood for decades, gone. And Sergio Perez finished second in the Drivers' Championship. Let that sit for a second. Second in the world. Behind only the man widely considered the greatest driver on the grid at that moment. 8 podiums, 2 wins, the kind of season that, at Ferrari or Mercedes, would have earned you a statue. At Red Bull, it earned you a contract extension, and a quiet understanding that your ceiling had just been defined. 2023 arrived, and Verstappen became something beyond sport. He won 19 races in a single season, the most in Formula One history. And Perez, finishing second in the championship again, was simultaneously praised as the best teammate Verstappen had ever had, and quietly questioned about whether he still deserved his seat. Here's the paradox the media rarely addressed directly. The better Verstappen got, the more important Perez's role became. And the more important he became, the more invisible he got. Because in a dominant car with a dominant driver, the second driver's job is to shadow, to hold position, to absorb the points that stop rivals from accumulating. Every time Perez finished behind Verstappen and ahead of Leclerc, he was executing exactly what the team required, and nobody clapped. Coming into 2024, something had shifted. Not the car, not the team, not even Verstappen. What shifted was the question being asked. For 2 years, the question had been, can Verstappen win the championship? Now the question was, can Perez keep up? Red Bull's car had been developed in large part around one driver's feedback, one driver's instincts, one very specific and aggressive driving style. And Verstappen's approach, mechanical, on the limit, deeply physical with the car, had become the philosophy embedded in the RB20. Some technical observers began arguing what few were willing to say on air, that the car had evolved into something genuinely difficult for drivers who didn't share Verstappen's specific inputs and instincts. Perez had always been exceptional in race conditions. Tire management, strategic patience, the long game. These were his weapons. But qualifying, always his relative weakness, became a crisis in 2024. And in the era of sprint weekends, street circuits, and media cycles that move faster than the cars. Qualifying gaps don't stay statistical. They become narratives. By mid-season, the narrative had been written. Consider the data. In 2021, on a more balanced car, Perez matched Verstappen's race pace on multiple occasions. In 2022, he outqualified him at several circuits across the calendar. By 2024, the gap in some qualifying sessions had grown beyond half a second. Did Sergio Perez suddenly forget how to drive a Formula One car? Or, as some engineers and analysts suggested, had the car's development direction moved past the range where his strengths could compensate? Was he being asked to justify his seat with a tool that had been built, fundamentally, for someone else? Red Bull never addressed that question publicly, not once. By the middle of 2024, Helmut Marko, Red Bull's legendary and famously direct talent advisor, was giving interviews with language that the paddock recognized immediately. Checo needs to find his form. We are evaluating all our options. The second seat is under review. In any other industry, this would be called what it is: a public performance review, designed to manage optics and prepare the audience for a conclusion that some insiders believed had already been reached. Because here's what the timeline shows. Reports and sources within the paddock indicated that Red Bull had begun preliminary conversations about driver availability for 2025, well before Perez's most difficult run of results in the second half of the season. If that framing is accurate, and multiple credible outlets reported versions of it, then the sequence of events becomes worth examining very carefully. The question being asked in public was, will Perez's results improve enough to justify his 2025 contract? But the question being answered in private, it seemed, had already moved on. And if you watch Perez during this stretch with that context in your mind, something about him shifts. He stopped performing optimism. He stopped trying to convince anyone of anything. He showed up. He drove. He scored points that Red Bull needed for the Constructors Championship. Even on his way out the door, whether he knew it or not, he was still doing exactly what the team had always needed him to do. In 2021, Max Verstappen won the Drivers' Championship by 8 points. That year, Sergio Perez scored 190 points for Red Bull. Take a moment with that. Without Sergio Perez's contributions, Verstappen's first World Championship doesn't happen. That's not sentiment, that's arithmetic. And in 2022 and 2023, as Perez absorbed points from Leclerc, from Russell, from Hamilton, he was the pressure valve, the buffer. The reason rivals could never get close enough to build real momentum. He was the wall that stopped the tide. 3 Constructors' Championships, 3 consecutive years of Red Bull dominance, the most successful sustained era in the team's modern history. And Sergio Perez is woven into the foundation of all of it, in the data, in the standings, in every strategic calculation that kept the titles from slipping away in tight moments. But when the story of the Red Bull dynasty gets written, his name appears in the footnotes. This is the arrangement he agreed to. He understood the role. There's no suggestion he was deceived about what the team hierarchy looked like. But there is a difference between accepting a role and being quietly erased from the story you helped write. Abu Dhabi, December 2024. Sergio Perez qualified. He started the race. He drove it clean. And when it was over, he took off his helmet in the garage, for the last time in Red Bull colors. And he didn't say very much. No dramatics, no parting shots in the press conference. No carefully worded post designed to keep the conversation going. Just a man who seemed to understand completely what had happened, and chose not to perform grief for an audience that was already moving on. People who were present in the Red Bull garage that weekend later described Perez as remarkably composed, that the weight in the room seemed to sit heavier on everyone else than it did on him. Maybe, by that point, The weight had already been set down. Here is what Red Bull never said out loud about Sergio Perez's exit. It wasn't a failure story. It was a success story that got closed once the job was finished. Perez didn't fall short of what Red Bull needed. By most measurable accounts, he delivered it. Every year. In the moments that mattered most, he was there. And when Verstappen became so dominant that the second driver was no longer a swing factor in the championship, when the dynasty had grown secure enough that it no longer required a guardian, Perez became something the team hadn't needed to plan for. Not because he got worse, but because, in the most important sense, the work was done. The cruelest thing about being the perfect number 2 is this: the better you are at the job, the faster you make yourself unnecessary. Sergio Perez spent 3 years being essential to a team that was always, quietly, building toward the moment it wouldn't need him anymore. He enabled the dynasty that consumed him, and the dynasty never looked back. The second seat is never just a seat, it's a contract. And some of the most important terms, the ones that determine how the story ends, were never written down anywhere Perez could read them.